Amen. Good morning. Okay, so last Sunday we took an amazing field trip around the entire East Boca Eruv. Special thank you to Rabbi Wilkach and Reb Josh. And we discovered together that it's one of the best Eruvin in the world. The integrity of the Eruv, the structure, the creativity involved, not relying on too many poles and strings, but a lot of natural or man-made solid barriers like walls. Question, though, remains, is there still a position for one to say, you sound like you have a wonderful Eruv, however, I don't carry in an Eruv. I don't hold of your Eruv. Not because you did anything inappropriate. I understand you have a magnificent Eruv, but I just don't use an Eruv. Well, it's also Mechaber Shita. Let's see. Perhaps. So we mentioned this a few weeks ago. This is the Mechaber in Shin Mem Hey Sif Zayin. Right, just to get our bearings here, we mentioned the background that generally speaking, if you have a Reshus Harabim Gemura, a Reshus Harabim Min HaTorah, then you can't use a Tzuras HaPesach to enclose the area to make it considered a Reshus HaYachid. And the svara was, Kivin the Rabbim Bokin Ba, since you have masses going through this area, masses going through on a deraisa level, so then having a conceptual mechitza doesn't work. You have to have real walls. And therefore, generally speaking, the only time you're allowed to use a Tzuras HaPesach to enclose a city is if you're working with the assumption that the city is not a Reshus Harabim and HaTorah, but it's a Carmelis. So it therefore becomes very relevant. How do we define the Reshus Harabim in HaTorah? So the Mechaber quotes two opinions. Sif Zayin. Ezehu Reshus Harabim. So the Gemara has two basic criteria. Rechovos u'shvokim ha'rechovim sheish esrei ama. If you have streets and areas where there's a thoroughfare that are at least 16 amos wide, ve'ena makurim, and there's no roof, there's no covering over those areas, ve'en lehem choma, and there's no wall, afilu yesh lehem chova, or even if there is a choma, there is a wall around the majority of the city, imhei mefuloshim mishar l'shar, if they're open from one side to the other side, and you have this massive highway going straight through the entire city, so the Mechaber says, Harei Reshus Harabim, that is a Reshus Harabim deraisa. So there's two basic factors. Do you have streets that are 16 amos wide? And the second is, assuming it's not Makura, you have no ceiling or roof over those streets, and the masses are going through that area, that's a Reshus Harabim. So based on this definition of Reshus Harabim, would Chicago be a Reshus Harabim deraisa? Would LA be a Reshus Harabim deraisa? Would Kansas, most of the cities in Kansas, be a Reshus Harabim deraisa? As long as you have streets that are 16 amos, how many feet? 16 amos? Be'erich? 28, yeah, in that range. So that means that most normal cities in the world are considered Reshus Harabim deraisa. Right here in Boca Raton, Florida. Reshus Harabim deraisa according to the first day of the Mechaber, of course. Right, you have Spanish River. That's more than 30 feet wide. So generally speaking, according to the first opinion, it would be very difficult to create an Eruv around the city using a Tzuras HaPesach. Now he has the famous V'yesh Omrim. V'yesh Omrim shekol she'ein shishim ribo ovrim bo b'chol yom eino Reshus Harabim. This is the Shita of Rashi, and we'll see others as well, that if you don't have 600,000 people going through the area every single day, then it's not a Reshus Harabim min HaTorah. Okay, so that would mean now the majority of cities in America are probably not a Rishus Harabim min Torah. Boca Raton, Florida, you have many streets that are more than 16 amos wide. Eino Makura, do you have Shishim Ribo going Spanish River, B'chol Yom? Not even close, right? So maybe there are a few exceptions where, talk about Brooklyn, major areas where there's intense urban life, and you have millions of people living there. Okay, or highways that could go from city to city. But generally speaking, within a city, your average place does not have Shishim Ribo over in B'chol Yom. Now we have to define what that means, but those are the two basic opinions of the Mechaber, and there's obviously a massive nafkamina. The nafkamina is, in the majority of cities, are you allowed to make an Eruv using a Tzuras Pesach? What is the simple mashmos of the Mechaber? How does he paskin, like the first shita l'chumra or like the second shita l'kula? Pashut Pshat, using the principles of how do we paskin in general, we have a stam and a yesh omrim. The stam is l'chumra, you don't need shishim ribo, and therefore most places are Rishus Harabim deraisa. It sounds like that's the ikar shita of the Mechaber if all we saw was shin mem hey, sif zayin. Now, the Mishnah Berurah comes along here in Sifkat and Chaf Gimel. This is towards the second half. Ule'inyan halacha. Midasa mechaber dekosav deyazo rak b'shem yesh omrim. The fact the mechaber has this lenient opinion that you need shishim ribo for Rishus Harabim, he presents it as a yesh omrim. It's a mashma de la halacha lo svir lekein. It sounds like it doesn't hold that way. Umikol makom ein bonu koach limchos biyad hasomchim al dazo. Nonetheless, we shouldn't make a macha against those who want to rely on the yesh omrim. The deyazo gam kein lo das yichidahi. You should know this is not a minority opinion. It's not just one rishon or Kamosha Kesafti with Be'er Lacha, like I explained in the Be'er Lacha, there are actually many Rishonim who hold like Shitas Rashi. V'chein stidadu kama achronim. And we also find many achronim who paskin the kula like Shitas Rashi, like the Yesh Omrim of the Mechaber. V'chol bal nefesh yachmir la'atzmo. However, concludes the Chafetz Chaim famously that anyone who is a bal nefesh, who has a sensitivity towards ruchnius, which is hopefully all of us, yachmir la'atzmo, he should be machmir for himself. What is that expression, yachmir la'atzmo? Meaning, I'm not going to make a macha against those who are mekel. I understand they have what to be so mechan. I'm not going to make a whole a rash that I can't believe people are carrying in the Eruv and they're relying on the yesh omer of the Mechaber. But for myself, if I'm a bal nefesh, it's kedai yachmir la'atzmo. Okay. So by a show of hands, how many balei nefesh do we have here in the room? Hopefully everybody. And then by a show of hands, how many people sometimes, once in a while, b'shas adchak, carry in the Eruv? Right? Many people also. So we'll have to explore how this all works out. The Be'er Lacha here, he quotes the Taz and the Magen Avram. The Taz and the Magen Avram both say that the majority of poskim actually go like the yesh omrim of the Mechaber. Right? The majority of poskim are mekel. And therefore, it's mashma from the Taz and the Magen Avram, right, who are two major achronim, that there's a lot to be so mechan. That might be the shita of Rov poskim. Then the Be'er Lacha goes on to explain, the truth is, you find many Rishonim in each direction, and he lists all of them. And it comes out, if you're to count how many Rishonim say like the Stam and how many say like the Yesh Omrim, it comes out that it's 12 against 12. So you have 12 Rishonim who are paskening like the Stam, that you don't need Shishim Riba for Rishus Harabim in HaTorah, and you have 12 Rishonim who are paskening like the Yesh Omrim. And then he adds here that the Marshal and the Masas Binyamin also paskin l'chumra, like the Stam. So that's why, for Balei Nefesh, it makes sense to be Machmir La'atzmo. Okay. Now, there was a massive debate between the Mishkanas Yaakov and the Beis Ephraim. Those are two famous tshuvas on the subject of do we pass them like the Stam or the Yesh Omrim here. Mishkanas Yaakov writes a lengthy tshuva where he basically says the minig olam is that cities are relying on the Yesh Omrim, and that's why they create an Eruv Tzur Pesach, even though the streets are 16 amos. That's the minig olam. However, they're all making a massive mistake, because really the majority of shitas paskin the chumrah, like the stam of the machaber, not the Yesh Omrim. Says the Mishkanas Yaakov, how do I understand what the Taz and the Magen of Ram said? Taz and the Magen of Ram told us that the Rov Shitos are paskening like the Yesh Omrim Lakula. So says the Mishkanas Yaakov, that's because they read the Beis Yosef. If you look in the Beis Yosef, he does quote more opinions who are Mekel like Shitas Rashi, more so than the Machmirim. However, since the time of the Taz and the Magen of Ram, we do have more Rishonim that we, Baruch Hashem, have found, have been printed. And when you explore the sugya carefully, especially with the new manuscripts, there are definitely more opinions who are machmir, more so than those who are mekel. So therefore the Mishkanas Yaakov somewhat pushes aside the Taz and the Magen Avram. Now there is a whole interesting discussion, maybe for a different time. That could be a good shiur to look forward to. Klalei Psak, when it comes to these types of issues of you have Rov Shitas, but the majority is only now that we have new manuscripts that were discovered and published, they didn't have 600 or 700 years ago. What kind of relevance do those have in halacha? Interesting shaila.
Is the reason why the Shitas are machmir is because the Eruv might be not kosher, or even if it was a perfect state in a...
It sounds like even if theoretically it was an East Boca Eruv, makes no difference. The bottom line is Spanish River is 16 amos. Dixie, all these streets are 16 amos. Einu Mukura, the masses travel there. That's a Rishus Rabbim Deraisa according to the Stam of the Mechaber. Yeah.
In the language of the Shabbos, it's like using a double negative. I was wondering if there was a reason. Are there more things that we haven't gotten to yet? Of like
double negative where?
If you don't have 60, then it's not a Rishus rather than saying you need 60,000 to make it Rishus Rabbim.
600.
I mean, sorry.
Right. It's a good question. Good question. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Just to spell out, where does 600,000 come from? Why would Rashi assume you need that to have the din of Rishus Rabbim Deraisa? Because that was Machane Yisrael. That was the encampment of Klal Yisrael in Midbar, which is clear from the Gemara we're deriving everything else from. Now, one of the main questions on this Shita is, why would the Gemara not say that? The Gemara only says you have to have streets that are Tes Zayin Amma and Einu Makura. If there is also a requirement that you need Shishim Ribo, that should be said explicitly. That's a major nafkamina l'maisa. So that's the big kasha on this shita. But nonetheless, there are many Rishonim who assume this is the halacha. So the Mishkanas Yaakov came along and basically paskined that the stam, the chumrah, is rov shitos, and therefore the whole idea of these cities being mekel to use the Tzur Pesach is batos. The tshuva of the Beis Ephraim argues back, and also a lengthy tshuva, but he maintains that lav dafka, you're correct, and it could be when the Magen Avram and the Taz said rov poskim, they were aware of many of the Rishonim, but their point was the majority of poskim that are generally machriya the halacha, meaning the way you come to a psak is not just by counting how many shitas you have in each direction, but who are these shitas? Beis Ephraim says the minig in Klal Yisrael is a minig kosher, and people have what to be so mechan. If you take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan, this is on page 10. Aruch HaShulchan here in the third paragraph. Right, so he quotes some of the background, some of the Rishonim. He says, "V'al pi shita zo," based on the shita of Rashi that you need shishim ribo. Havi kol heta eruvin in our medinos. Every medina that has an eruv is based on the yesh omrim of the mechaber. Mipnei shebechol arim shalonu ein shishim ribo ovrim ve'einam reshus harabim. You don't have that many people traveling, and therefore it's not a reshus harabim deraisa. Ulechein moel behem tzuras Pesach, and that's why we assume that tzuras Pesach would work. The Lashita Rishona, Kevin the Rechov Shalonu, Rechovim Tes Zayin Amma, according to the first opinion of the Mechaber, since our streets, even going back, a couple hundred years ago, they were definitely Tes Zayin Amma, Ein Shum Heter, then there would be no leniency whatsoever to create an Eruv. Tehei Rishus Harabim Gomor. Then he says, V'hinei Mefarshe Shulchan Aruch Kosvo, he's referring to the Magen Avraham and the Taz, the Rov HaPoskim Sovrim Kashita Zo, that most poskim hold like the lenient opinion of Rashi, the Yesh Omer of the Mechaber. Ha'omnam, however, Echad Mea Gedolim Bedor Shilifanenu, one of the Gedolim of the previous generation, referring to the Mishkanas Yaakov, Hirish Ha'olam Ala Eruvim Shalonu. He made a big rash about the Eruvin Shalonu. V'hera Ba'alil Sha'osrim Heim Harbe Yosem Heim Mekilim. And he shows in his tshuva that there are more osrim than makilim. Ach mefarshe Shulchan Aruch lo Rome. However, the Taz and the Magen of Rome did not see all of these perushim, ki lo nidvasu b'yameim, because they were not yet published in their time. And then he lists who the makilim are and who the machmirim are. However, his last paragraph is powerful. Levadze richu levayer. He says the Mishkanas Yaakov in his lengthy tshuva also explains that even Rashi's shita is not so clear. When he says you need shishim ribo, how do we know that means shishim ribo ovrim bo b'chol yom? Right, the Mishnah Berurah himself pointed that out in the lashon of the Mechaber. Where does that come from? And that might not actually be shitas Rashi. However, in the middle of this last paragraph, he says, "Aval al kol panim ma moel arichos." What's it going to help all of our pilpul and lengthy conversation on this topic? Acharei she'eruvin nispashtu berov ari Yisrael harbe ma'oshana mikodem v'rak al smach heter zeh. For hundreds of years, we've been relying on this assumption that the Yesh Omrim is either correct or definitely can be relied upon. U'ke'ilu bas kol yotza halacha kashita zo. It's almost as if a baskel came down min hashamayim and said, we paskin like shitas Rashi, like the Yesh Omrim. V'im bonu la'akev, and if we were going to take a similar approach to the Mishkanas Yaakov and tell people they can't rely on an Eruv, lo levad shelo yitzaisu, not only would they not listen to us, ela nira kamishta goyim, we would look like fools. They would think we're crazy. Shedavar zed nispashed b'chol Yisrael u'beposkim. This has been common practice in Klal Yisrael. Da'idna ein lanu reshus harabim rak ba'orim sfuros v'gedolos ba'olam. That we don't have reshus harabim in HaTorah, with the exception of maybe a few cities in the world. Okay.
So you see this that in halal, Gemara brings down very often situations where people were not going to listen to it and they didn't enforce the halakha.
So that's true, but that's usually when there's a gezerah involved, right? When there's a gezerah of pasakum, or there's a gezerah of a takana of Ezra, and then we see that Rov Klal Yisrael are not able to do it, so then that gezerah doesn't really have a chalos. But this is a shaila of what is the din deraisa. But Aruch Shulchan saying, yeah.
Wide and 600,000 people passing through, or one or the other?
Well, everyone agrees it has to be 16 amos wide, right? And Eno Makura. The question is, do you also need Shishim Ribo?
I'm saying, then what's the reason to make it make help if streets are all 16?
You don't have Shishim Ribo. Meaning that if you pass in like the stam of the Mechaber, you could never put an Eruv around this area, right? The streets are Tes Zayin Amma. If you pass in like the Yesh Omrim, so then you don't have Shishim Ribo going down Spanish River, no problem. It's a Carmelis. You're allowed to use a Tzuras of Pesach to enclose it, to make it into a Rishus Yochid.
Carlos, because you don't have 600,000?
Yeah.
You I mean, you need both, in my opinion. Is 16 amos
Yes,
counted as
yes.
perfect?
The 16 amos is explicit in the Gemara. So both opinions say, Avada, you need that for Rishus Rabbim. The only question is that which is not explicit in the Gemara of Shishim Ribo. So the Mishkanas Yaakov says, we don't paskin like that. Beis Ephraim says, we do paskin like that. Aruch HaShulchan is telling us, this is the minig HaPoshet. This is what Klal Yisrael has been doing for hundreds of years. It's Kilu, a Baskel came Amin Shemayim and says, we're allowed to be Somich and the Yesh Omrim of the Mechaber. I want to do one more step here. Question? If you had an actual wall, then even if it's Rishus Rabbim Deraisa, no problem, because that transforms it into a real Rishus Yochid. Let's go through a couple practical examples. There was a question that came up in the late 1930s about creating an Eruv in Paris. So they sent the Shaila to the Gadol Hador, Reb Chaim Ozer. Reb Chaim Ozer in his Tshuva Nachiezer, this is in Siman Ches. We'll read a couple of lines together. He says, regarding your Shaila of Tikkun Eruvin beParis, so initially I didn't want to get involved with this. However, you kept on pushing me. Basically, I don't want to hack with your politics. Can you have an Eruv in your city or not? But because you keep on pressuring me and sending me letters, so I felt I had to respond. However, before I wrote back, I consulted with one of the Rabbanim in our city in Vilna, who is the head of the Eruv, and they also consulted with Harav, Hagon, Morenu, Rabbeinu, Avrom, Yeshaya, Karelet, Shlita, B'Bnei Brak, the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish is viewed as the Mora Asra of Eruvin. It's an amazing thing. Throughout Halacha, we find that even in the contemporary poskim, there's almost like an assumption that different poskim had an authority on different areas of Halacha. When it comes to Chashmal, right, all shilas of electricity, Reb Shlomo Zalman was the Mora Asra of electricity. When it comes to Eruvin, the Chazon Ish was the Mora Asra, and in many places we have a Masorah, the Paskin like the Chazon Ish, even over the Mishnah Berurah, when it comes to Eruvin shilas. So Reb Chaim Ozer writes back, I consulted with the Chazon Ish, and this is what we came up with.
When was this, in 1930?
1938.
38.
Right?
Yeah, really.
Which is now an amazing thing. This is like on the cusp of total destruction. And Lamaisa, they're discussing, can we make an Eruv in Paris? You know, that was the Shiloh. So the first paragraph, right, you could imagine if you were the one sending the Shiloh and now reading the Tshuva from Chaim Ozer, after reading the first paragraph, you'd feel somewhat deflated. He says, V'hinei bevadei nira, sheperes hay rishus harabim gemurim min haTorah sheyesh ba shishim ribo bokim. That Paris should be rishus harabim, because you definitely have shishim ribo throughout the city, so you don't even have the shitas of the yesh omrim to rely on. Everyone would assume it's a rishus harabim min haTorah. He says that the Shoel mentions a shita that maybe you could rely on the Or Zarua, who says the filu shishim ribokim niter bebeis mechitzos, that even if you do have shishim ribo, if you have 2 mechitzos, that might be sufficient. And the way he describes Paris is that, and we'll see in a moment, there might be 2 real walls going on 2 sides of the city. But to that, Reb Chaim Ozer says, we don't paskin that 2 mechitzos would be sufficient for a real Rishus Harabim. We paskin like the Shita of the Chachamim in the Gemara, that you need 3.
And the application of that nowadays would be if I have a highway and I have some walls on either side the
Oh, so he'll get into that in a second. And then he says, Shuvri Isi in the Beis Ephraim, and the Beis Ephraim was the one who was makel against the Mishkanas Yaakov, but even the Beis Ephraim writes in the Tshuva, I don't see any real heter to make an Eruv in Paris. That seems to me like a real Rishus Harabim in HaTorah. However, in the next paragraph he says, the way you're presenting the Mitzias is that there might actually be 3 walls around the city, We actually have. This is a perfect shiur, no?
It is.
Mamish a perfect shiur. Have you been carrying in the streets at all? No? Yeah?
Here
In Paris.
in Paris.
There's no Eruv B'chlal.
No.
So it was never created? There's mamish nothing? That's rough. Wow. It's hard enough to live in France as it is. Yeah, that's stam rough. And then not to have an Eruv. Okay.
In the Jewish community itself, there's no
Interesting. So he says, according to the way you're presenting it, that maybe there are 3 walls around the city. How do you have 3 walls around the city of Paris? So that's based on potentially the sea walls. Okay. Now we do know there's a din of telemus laked, which means what? If you have a vertical wall that's going down 10 tefachim, that's the shir of a mechitza. If it's within daled amos, we view that as a kosel.
What about the river, sand?
So it depends. You have to have a real mechitza, right? Telemus laked. So he discusses whether or not this is true, and if it's actually helpful. There is a sheet in the Rishonim that natural barriers might not count as a mechitza. We saw before together that you don't have to create something with the intention of this is going to be an Eruv. You're allowed to use man-made structures like telephone poles, but there is a shita that if it's just a natural mitzias, that might not have a din of a mechitza. But even in that chumrah, says Reb Chaim Ozer, it seems like the way they did it in Paris is they also were adding on to the barriers because you have many areas where ships come in, so it is considered man-made. So he has stadim lakan and stadim lakan. He concludes, though, he says that there does seem to be room to be makel to make an eruv, and then his last paragraph is v'ha'etza ha'yutza l'maisa l'sakin es hagesharim. He says that even if you'll tell me that you do have 3 walls around the city, there are definitely breaches in those walls. And often the breaches are based on where the bridges are. Now, we learned together that if you have omid merubal haporetz, right, you have more wall than you do open space, then it's still considered enclosed. The exception to that rule, though, is if you have a pirza that's more than 10 amos wide. So many of the pirzas here are obviously more than 10 amos wide. The shaila, though, is, does having a pirza more than 10 amos wide invalidate this on a deraisa level? Or do we say, min haTorah, as long as you have more mechitza than pirza, it's still considered a reshusa yochid? And it's only midirabanan we say that if it's more than 10 amos, you have to be misake in that. Why is this relevant? Why is it relevant? Because that if you'll taina that it's invalid min haTorah, this is not considered enclosed, and you have shishim ribo here, then it's a reshusa rabim deraisa, and putting up poles and strings to be misake in the breaches are not going to help. Says Reb Chaim Ozer, and we'll see the Chazon Ish holds the exact same thing, that when you have an opening, a pirza more than 10 amos, that only invalidates this area midirabanan. But midiraisa, as long as you have more mechitza than you do open space, and you have 3 mechitzos, midiraisa, that is a reshusa yachid. So concludes Reb Chaim Ozer, because I view it as still a reshusa yachid min haTorah, assuming your mitzias is correct that you have 3 walls, so then you could be masakin and eruv by using a tzuras Pesach. But the last paragraph is where we see a little bit of a glimpse into the geoinus of Reb Chaim Ozer. And therefore I feel you could fix up the openings by the bridges using a tzuras Pesach. And v'yochel lismoch al tzuras Pesach shel chute telegraph. You could rely on the telegraph cables she'asuyim kahalacha, assuming they're made kahalacha like we've spoken about, has to be literally al gabehen. Ve'enan min hatzad. Ubevadai yisyashev kavod turoscha im harabonim hagoonim beiro. However, you should definitely consult with the rabbonim in your city, V'hineinu maskimim itom lahalacha. And we agree with them lahalacha.
Pushing it up.
Is that amazing, right? I'm telling you some of the basics. Here are the klalim. Speak to the gedolim in your city, and we agree. How can you agree with them? You don't know what they're paskening. And the answer is, I don't care. If whatever they paskin, we agree with them. Yesod Gadol. Okay, let's do quickly the Chazon Ish here. Throughout the Sefer of the Chazon Ish, do we have more chumras or more kulas? What is it commonly known for? Right, the Chazon Ish was very machmir. His Shiur v'tefach was very big, right? Many chumras of the Chazon Ish. However, the truth is you'll find the majority of earth-shattering chidushim in the Sefer Chazon Ish lekula, not lechumra. And this is one of the many examples. We spoke about Paris. It sounds like they never built an Eruv there, unfortunately. In America, the big questions are Brooklyn and Manhattan, right? So, Shaila is like this. Let's talk about Manhattan for a moment. Do you have Shishim Ribo in Manhattan? So, yeah, of course you do. The question, though, is how do you define Shishim Ribo? Does it mean you need 600,000 people b'chol yom on one street to make that street a Rishus Rabbim? Or does it mean throughout the entire city? And how do you define the city? Ramosha has a chumrah and a kula. Ramosha says to have a Rishus Rabbim in HaTorah, which seems to be the simple reading of the Mechaber in the Yesh Omrim, is you have to have Shishim Ribo B'chol Yom going down this street. And only then this street becomes a Rishus Rabbim in HaTorah.
Is it a lot of day or 24 hours?
So the shaila is like this. However, so that on one hand is a kula, right? Because even massive streets with a lot of traffic, as long as you have 6 or 7 massive streets, it's very likely that you don't have Shishim Ribo on each one, or in any of them. However, Moshe says that if you have Shishim Ribo using the streets of a city at one time, so then every single street on that grid has a din of Rishus Rabbim min HaTorah. And the cheshbon he gives is, if you have 12 by 12 mil, right, call it 8.5 miles by 8.5 miles, which is not a massive area, if you have at least 3 million residents within 8.5 by 8.5 miles, then the assumption is you have Shishim Ribo on all of the streets b'chol yom, and therefore that whole area is considered Rishus Rabbim min HaTorah. So it comes out that in Ramosha's world, there is a potential for kula and potential for chumrah. The Chazon Ish, though, has an incredible chiddush l'kula. Let's take Manhattan. 8.5 miles by 8.5 miles. Do we have 3 million people in that area? Yes. So the chara, that should be Rishus Rabbim deraisa. And therefore, there's no chance in the world you could use a Tzuras of Pesach to make an Eruv in Manhattan.
Said 1.6 million people come into the city every day.
Come into the city every day.
Yeah.
Okay.
The fact that you have to pay $9 to enter the city, does that make it a private residence now, and so you don't even need an Eruv?
It's a good try. Good try. So the Chazon Ish, though, has an incredible chiddush. Let's read just a few lines together on page 12. Near the chol sheyesh gimel mechitza shel omed meruba lo amrinan su the osur rab mevatli mechitzta. As long as you have 3 mechitzos, right, that creates a Rishus Rabbim a Rishus Yochid min HaTorah. So then even if you have Shishim Ribo, it would still be Rishus Yochid. V'lo matzinu chilek ben gimel mechitzos l'daled l'inyan deraisa, ulefize, accordingly, Betsura Hazos, in this diagram, which we're going to explore momentarily, Lo Timtza Rishus Rabbim, you will not find the Rishus Rabbim. So let's take a look at the diagram. This is created by the Chazon Ish. We should probably show the camera, right? I'm not sure if you can see it. But you have here 3 massive streets. You have Rishus Rabbim Aleph is Madison. Rishus Rabbim Gimel is fifth. Are those parallel? Yeah. And then Rishus Rabbim Beis would be 57th. Okay. So these are massive streets with hundreds of thousands of people. Writes the Chazon Ish, it could be Rishus Rabbim Aleph, Beis, and Gimel are not really Rishus Rabbim, based on the following cheshbon. If you were to look at a bird's eye view of Manhattan, so you have Madison, and then what do you have on each side of Madison? You have massive buildings, you have skyscrapers, right? Living in Boca, when the kids are raised in Florida, they have no clue what a skyscraper is. You take them to Meisner Park, is that a skyscraper? So you have these massive buildings, and it's not like you have miles between the buildings, right? You could have a few feet. So theoretically, you could argue on each side of Madison, you have Omid Meruba al Haporetz. You have more mechitza than you do open space. So right there, that would mean, l'chora, that Madison, although it's a massive, more than Tesainama, and you could have Shishim Ribo, but you have walls on each side. Okay, but 2 walls, we paskin is not sufficient. How? Okay, but take a look. Says the Chazon Ish, when you see the diagram here, Rechov, Rishus Rabbim Beis, which is 57th. Assuming that comes to an end at some point. Central Park, does that make sense? Yeah. Maybe? Okay. I've been living in Boca too long. Turn it around, that'll be Central Park. So assuming that comes to an end, so that means Rishus Rabbim Beis is now surrounded by how many sides? 3 sides by mechitzos. Parallel on each side you have Omen and Rubal Aporetz, and then when it comes to an end, assuming you have buildings here as well, Omen Merubal Aparetz. So now that means Rishus Rabbim Beis is really Min HaTorah a Rishus Yachid. Let's assume it has a wall for a second, okay?
We're at the zoo.
So now, what does that mean for Rishus Rabbim Aleph and Gimel? So Rishus Rabbim Aleph and Gimel are both going into Rishus Rabbim Beis. If Rishus Rabbim Beis is considered mukaf, it's considered enclosed, so then, writes the Chazon Ish, we view it as Rishus Rabbim Aleph and Gimel. They have on each side Omed Merubal Aparetz, and it's going into a Rishus Yachid. That's considered a third wall, even though it's mamish opened. So that would mean that these 3 massive streets all have a din of Rishus Yachid min HaTorah, and therefore you could use a Tzuras Pesach. Millions of people here, massive skyscrapers. That's a Rishus Yachid min HaTorah. Now take a look at the last paragraph of the Chazon Ish in Ozayin. V'yotzu lonu mizeh debizman hazeh kol hashvakim v'rechovo shebekrokim hayoser gedolim. It comes out counterintuitive. All of the streets in these massive urban areas, hein Rishus Yachid gemura min HaTorah. They could be viewed as Rishus Yachid mamish min HaTorah. Dekulan timtza behen achas mukefes gimel mechitzos, because you could always find one of them enclosed by gimel mechitzos. Vehi Rishus Yachid, and therefore transforming that street to Rishus Yachid. V'chol rechovos hapasuchos la, and therefore all the other streets going into that one, they're also now a din of Rishus Yachid. Kiven shekein hein nitaris b'tzuras Pesach, and therefore they could be rectified with the Tzuras Pesach.
This rule that goes into Shusach, where did that come?
Well, what he's saying is that assuming it has 2 of its own walls, right? Then now it's going into Rishus Yachid. That Rishus Yachid, even though it's open, because this is considered mukaf min HaTorah, that's considered now a third wall. So an incredible chiddush of the Chazon Ish. According to this, there'd be a lot of room to be mekel with the creation of an Eruv in Manhattan.
Can you have the wall going down the middle of the wall? If, like the right side of the page, of the diagram, A and Aleph and Gimel would be fine, but what about on the left side? Or would you have 2 separate Eruvin?
In a sense, they'd be 2 separate Eruvin meeting up in the same spot in the middle, potentially. I want to do one more source here, this is from Ramosha. Ramosha has a very long tshuva discussing pros and cons of making an Eruv in Manhattan, but then later on in Igros Moshe, he has a...
Boca's worse than Manhattan.
Right, that's what it comes out. Lefi, this Chiddush of the Chazon Ish, Boca is harder to make an Eruv than Manhattan. Oyim v'nora. Says Ramosha here on page 13, the question that he's addressing is Im limchos biyad makilin lasos Eruv in Manhattan. Ramosha did not agree with the Chiddush of the Chazon Ish. He writes as follows, Hine, regarding Manhattan, Biarti barichos besifri Igros Moshe earlier on, kol hatzadim sheyesh lahakol v'yesh lahachmir. I've explained all of the tzadim for Kula and Chumrah. V'amaskona la'anias daiti de Manhattan lo dami l'mashe nogu lahakol b'shar makomos. He says, my conclusion is that Manhattan should not be viewed the same way we look at other cities. And since you have so many hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people there, it's very hard to be makel. It's hard to be makel because this might be considered shishim ribo, a reshus harabim deraisa. V'gam raya gedol mashe b'Yerushalayim lo asu erev lahatir ulechein eini roa davar sheyashana daiti b'zeh. We're not going to get into his raya of Yerushalayim. Right, so he spoke at length about this in his other tshuva. We're going to leave out the raya for now. But basically he's saying that my opinion has not changed regarding the Eruv in Manhattan. I don't feel comfortable supporting that. However, I also said that we can't make a maha against those who are mekel. And when they do establish an Eruv, it will be mutter according to some shitos. Why would it be mutter? Because according to some shitos, if Lamaisi you could view it, and he's not referring to the Chazon Ish here. He's talking about the stam, that it might not be considered shishim ribo. So gam heim rabbanim gedolim, and the shitos who are mekel, you do have rabbanim gedolim. Umiyimcha behem mikiven shesovim lefi hachrosam sheichol lesakein behem ruyim lahara. How can you make a macha if they're coming out with the conclusion that you'd be able to make an Eruv there and they're roy for hara?
Going like in the Paris thing, he says leaves it up to everyone else.
Yes, we do see a similar hashkafa here. Here it's a little bit different because Lamaisa, he lived in New York. He was the Morad Asra, Right, okay. Avalani ba'atzmi, and this is an interesting hashkafa, but personally, Eini yochel l'sayya b'zeh. I can't support this endeavor. The avshia tikun legabe elim metaltalin sham, because even though the way you're presenting it to me is that people do carry, and we definitely have a large segment of the population who is not so careful with certain areas of Shabbos, maybe especially when it comes to Hotzah. So by making an Eruv here, and you're relying on certain shitas, you're helping those people who would be carrying anyway. Umatzin meshusa yachid l'sham shelo kedin. Ubetikunim yarvichu shiyu mutarim le'eze shitos. And now according to some shitos, what they're doing is mutter. Mikol mokom hala umas zeh yeh kilku lagabe nashim kesherim. But on the other hand, this might be viewed as a yerida for those nashim kesherim that up until now have not been carrying in Manhattan, and now they hear that there's going to be an Eruv, so then they're going to start carrying, and according to some shitas, what they're doing is aser. Of a rabbanim hasovrim sheyesh l'sakin v'shoyim lasos kamo shehem sovrim. The Maisa, if the rabbanim want to do it, they can. I'm not going to make a macha, but I'm not going to participate either. What would Ramosha say in the following case? If you're living in a community, fill in the blank, where Kamat everyone is not so nizar in Shabbos. They're not so careful. And people are caring. And maybe there is some kind of makeshift Eruv, but it's not at all done kahalacha. What would Moshe say in that case? Would he encourage an Eruv, or would he stay somewhat on the sidelines? So I think it's clear from this tshuva, he would definitely encourage an Eruv. Now if you were to ask Moshe, can I put your name on this and let everyone know, assuming you had the same complexities as Manhattan, he would likely say, No, don't do that. Because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. But interesting hashkafa. We didn't get a chance to get to Brooklyn. Ramosha, bottom line, held that in Brooklyn you do have a real Rosh Hashanah Gemura, and therefore Tzuras Pesach would not work.
Did the Chazon Ish work in Brooklyn?
So it depends how it's laid out. Potentially you have to look at the map and see what would the Chazon Ish say in that case. The only way to really help Brooklyn is by making a wall and enclosing it and just shutting it off from the rest of the world. That would work. But
Back
yes.
at Manhattan.
Did we get to how to decide what is a city, like where you draw the lines, or can you say, I'm just talking about this one little part of it?
So it's a hard thing to know, where do you draw the lines of a city. It's not based on a map. It's based on, do you have streets that are directly going into the Rosh Hashanah, where those streets themselves are considered part of the Rosh Hashanah. As you get farther away of the main streets, and you have little suburban areas, likely those are no longer considered mafulish to the Rosh Hashanah. That's going to be a more complex conversation to know exactly where you could draw that line.
Part of the judgment between why Brooklyn was worse than Queens is because of the fact that it's called a city all in one, as opposed to Queens, which is smaller cities within a city because of the way the postal
Right.
system works.
Reb Moshe writes that in the Tshuva regarding the Eruv in Kew Garden Hills, that he was okay with that Eruv in Queens, but in Brooklyn he was not. All right, it's been a wonderful journey here. Have a wonderful day.